let's bring you some analysis now on the Senzo Meyiwa murder trial and the evidence that's been presented so far. We're joined by consulting forensic scientist Dr David Klatzow, who joins us this morning from Suffolk in the UK. Dr. Klatzow, it's great to speak to you on what is a story that's making headlines across South Africa and really one that people have been waiting to see some headway in for the past 8 years. So we want to talk to you about the DNA evidence and the integrity of the evidence that was collected at the scene. 8 years have passed since the murder actually happened. Does that have an impact?
Yes, it does have an impact. Look, fresh DNA evidence is always better than degraded DNA evidence. So depending on how it was collected, where it was collected, and the integrity of the crime scene, that plays a vital role in the interpretation of the subsequent evidence. So it's all very well to talk about major statistics when you've got a nice, fresh, uncontaminated sample. But given the inflection of time, that may not be apparent here, and one would need to look at that very carefully before one drew conclusions.
So when you talk about the way evidence is collected, specifically the way DNA evidence is collected, what is the way that would preserve that evidence in the best way?
Well, remember that DNA evidence is collected and that the current techniques that are in use magnify whatever you collect. It's like running it through a photocopier. You get a polymerase chain reaction which reproduces whatever you've collected hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of times. It's like taking a single sheet of paper and copying it 1,000 times or more. Now, the problem with that is that any contaminants that you pick up will be magnified along with the DNA. And if there's any contamination, in other words, if it's not a single DNA donor, that leads to problems in interpretation. So one's got to look at the DNA evidence very, very, very carefully to see how it was done, and one's got to get the basic lab reports that they got and the original police scene of crime reports that they would have got as to where they got it from. And that goes for all the forensic evidence. It goes as well for the ballistic evidence. I would be very suspicious of the ballistic evidence coming off a bullet, for instance. And I would want to check that bullet myself to see that it is what the police say it is, because that's not the case.
And if in a case it does emerge that the scene, for example, may have been contaminated, I mean, surely that has a massive effect on the integrity of the evidence itself and of the strength of the case.
Ultimately, your weakest link in the chain is the scene of crime itself, because that we've been unfortunately witness to major police bungling of the scene of the crime for many, many years now, and it hasn't got any better. So that would be the weakest link in your case, and that needs to be examined very carefully from all aspects. And always remember, you want the basic lab reports on every bit of forensic evidence that you get there. The attorneys don't often ask for it because they don't know to ask for it.
Dr. Klatzow, there's also this Netflix docuseries around the murder of Senzo Meyiwa, and one of the things, I mean, I'm not sure how much of that will play into court proceedings, but one of the things raised in the docuseries is that the scene of the crime was actually cleaned by a neighbor when Senzo Meyiwa was taken to hospital, as in the blood was cleaned up. If that is the case, if that turns out to be true, we can imagine what would be the impact on, for example, the collection of evidence. But can you tell us?
Of course, it would have a major impact. And if I remember correctly, with the Senzo Meyiwa case, we had our genius of police arrest or have people arrested at the time who were forced to be released within a few weeks. And there seems to have been a major bungle in the investigation. And I would dearly love to see that investigative process in its entirety before I'm prepared to place any faith in the police.
In terms of the case itself as it's unfolding in court, what you've just described about police's record and documented record over many, many years of bungling, particularly the evidence collection part of any investigation. One just wonders how much the defense will rely on that kind of evidence.
If the defense gets proper forensic scientific assistance, they could challenge that very successfully, I think, depending on how much evidence they can get out of the police. And the police often give them very truncated evidence which suits their case. They don't ever give you evidence which shows the weakness of what they've done. And it's part of the problem with forensic science. Forensic science is at the present undergoing a major knowledge transition from what it used to be to what it is now. And our police have certainly not kept up with that advance in forensic science.
Would you say it's also the interpretation of forensic evidence that plays a part?
Always interpretation of evidence is vital, and that's why when you get to interpret the evidence, you've got to see the ground data before you can interpret it adequately. And remember that you can pick up enough DNA to do a full analysis in the DNA that's left in a single fingerprint.
Yeah. Dr.
So
Klatzow,
contamination is always a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Klatzow, very interesting indeed talking to you. Thanks so much for joining us. Dr. David Klatzow is a consulting forensic scientist talking to us about the impact of the forensic evidence collection, particularly DNA forensic evidence collected in terms of the investigation into the murder of Senzo Meyiwa. He joins us on the line from Suffolk in the UK this morning.